Hello and welcome to Roportaj. This is Danish Bindabi. Vintage and imprint of Penguin Random House has come up with an important book titled Modi and India 2024 and the Battle of Bharat. Mr. Rahul, explain to the viewers, as you have tried to mention and explain in the book, about the concept of Bharat. What is this concept of Bharat? Is it inclusive for all, including especially the Muslims, or will it be exclusively for Hindus only?
It's a very good question, and I'm glad that you brought it up straight and foremost. First of all, this book is a book that I've written along with my co-author, Siddhartha Talya. We were approached by Penguin a few months ago, and they said, look, we would like you to write a book on the 2024 elections. And there was an option. Either one would go out into the field and write a reportage-driven more subjective analysis of what people are saying and a more cephalogically driven account of what we are seeing and then predict a trend, or we actually get to the crux and examine the basic issues that are being raised on the campaign trail. And it so happened that the India Alliance was born. The India Alliance, call it what you want to, was born. And I noticed that the thrust or the raison d'etre of that alliance was to argue for an inclusive Bharat, inclusive India. And in fact, one of the I's in the India bloc stands for inclusive. So they wanted to position themselves against what they called was a exclusive idea of Bharat, which was being propagated by the Bharatiya Janata Party and the larger Sangh Parivar. And I felt that this was the defining clash of the 2024 election, because when the India bloc announced its name, if you remember, there was a massive press conference and various stakeholders came on stage and they said that, look, this 2024 election is going to be a transformative, very consequential election for India. It is in fact our last chance to stop Modi, the BJP, because after 2024, this watershed election, a different kind of India is going to emerge. A Hindu India founded on the principles of Hindutva. And that India will be unrecognizable from the India that we today have accepted, and that derives its legitimacy from the constitution that was framed and adopted back in the day after independence. Now, I found that message to be a very aggressive. It's a very aggressive and a message that has the potential to divide India and the people, and also a message which perhaps was not very well reasoned, because politics is the art of making the possible, or rather the impossible, sound possible. And if you can sell fear in politics, you can win an election. And Trump did it in America. He sold a fear of America becoming marginalized, and more importantly, the white America becoming overrun by immigrants, etc. So he sold fear, he packaged fear, and he said, let's make America great again. And his entire thrust, his message was directed towards the white American male specifically. Now, there is no equivalent like that in India. You see, there is no celebrated idea of manhood, in India. There is no concept of that. We are all the same color. We are of the same culture. So this message that the India Alliance is trying to push forth, I felt was a very divisive one, because it has the potential to pit Indian against Indian. And I have also noticed that its origins lie in a form of intellectualism that became fashionable in the late 30s, 40s, and increasingly became crustified into an ideology in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Now, some people have loosely labeled it Nehruvian secularism, and I'm not one for labels, but one could loosely say that it was derived from a Marxist view of our history, where, rightly or wrongly, the need was felt to build a syncretic India, an India that would be able to live down the trauma of partition, and where Muslims particularly would feel comfortable amongst a majority of Hindus. And what did that mean? That meant that anyone who was looking to hyphenate our concept of India or Bharat with a larger Hindu ethos was immediately branded a Hindu fundamentalist, a Hindutvavadi. And there are a number of words that have been used. In fact, even Muslims, when they have said that they accept the worldview of the Sangh, for example, they are called Musangis. So if you look at my introduction itself of the book, I set the argument there. And I, in the introduction itself, go on to argue that it would be wrong to conflate the idea of Bharat, which is civilizational and harks back to a Hindu culture, with an exclusivist idea that you, for example, have seen birthed in Pakistan or Bangladesh or other Islamic states or Christian countries, Christian states. In fact, I believe that a Hindu India, not in the religious sense, in the cultural sense, will be much akin to a Hindu Britain, for example. Now, Britain, as you know, I have a chapter on this where we have gone into imagining what a Hindu state could be. And the chapter is basically, can India be tolerant without being secular? How to be both? And I talk about this in chapter 9 of the book. And as you know, yeah, as you have read the book and you've done a spectacular job of going page by page. So I've argued that we will not be a Hindu Pakistan, as Mr. Shashi Tharoor and others have sort of alluded to it, but a Hindu Britain. And what do we mean? We talk about the innate Hindu tolerance for multiculturalism and various forms of theism. And we say that's more akin to the temperament of Christians in several Christian majority nations like the United States, or even officially Christian nations like England. Indeed, if anything, the recent history of independent India suggests that a putative Hindu Rashtra would have more in common with Britain than with Pakistan. Britain has an official religion, Anglican Christianity. It is curious that Britain, which nudged modern Indian constitutionalism towards the liberal idea of secularism, would itself continue with an arrangement that has been associated with a parochial conservatism. And it does so unapologetically. And why do I say this? Because the central tenets of what people define as the Hindu culture is a very tolerant one. We're a dharmic civilization. We don't have a concept of the other. We are an umbrella that believe that you can be many different things and still be Hindu. So that's basically the fundamental reason why I say that even if one were to hypothetically become a Christian, like England is, a denotative Christian state, India would still remain a very secular country.
Rahul, the picture you had drawn of all these things is wonderful. But few questions that come to my mind, and I want you to answer them. First, you said that when the India came out and gave a press conference, it was sort of a threatening. But isn't this threatening when the BJP leaders completely tell you on stage in front of everyone that these Muslims, they marry 4 times, their population will undo us? What about such statements? One. Another thing, you have drawn parallels between Bharat after 2024 with the Britain. But can we see, or can we see those freedoms which are in Britain right now, like the freedom of press, freedom of minorities, of their religion, of other religions? Can we see all those freedoms in India when it will become Bharat in 2024?
Well, on the second question first, freedoms, freedom of press, and all of that, I'll take you back a few decades. You see, we look at history from a very now perspective. Let's look at history of independent India in a longer time frame. What was the First Amendment? The First Amendment wasn't brought by the RSS or by the BJP. It was brought by Pandit Nehru. And what was the central tenet of that First Amendment? The First Amendment, and there are now enough books written about this. The First Amendment was absolutely diametrically opposite to the First Amendment in America. The First Amendment here was to proscribe free speech. Originally, free speech was absolute in our country. But then we began, through legislation, to proscribe it. And this was done by Nehru. And why was it done? It was done because there were certain people in Bihar and other parts of the country that had begun to question him on certain ideas of governance that he was espousing. And in fact, he got up in the House and he said something to the effect of, look, I have been asked by the people, chosen by the people. And this was at a time, let me tell you, when he hadn't been elected. You see, this was not after 52. This was before. So it was an interim parliament. And he got up and what did he say? I have been chosen to lead India, to develop India, and anyone who is going to create obstacles in that path, they will have to be tamped down. They will have to be clamped down on. And we need the laws to stop this misinformation. Now, this is the kind of thing usually you would hear people who are excessively autocratic saying, because any dissidence is not tolerated. So that is one thing. But we recovered from that. The press recovered from that. Freedoms were proscribed. Then we come to the emergency. The emergency happens at a time when Mrs. Gandhi was positioning us as a secular democratic republic. And more than that, as a socialist country. Socialism, by definition, means that everyone has an equal stake in society. It's founded on equality. But what does she do? She imposes the Maintenance of Internal Security Act. She brings it in. All constitutional rights really get suspended. And an unequal society is created. If you're part of the Congress system, if you're part of government, you are in a different bracket. If you choose to support it, you're in a different bracket. If you're not, then you're persona non grata in this country. You have no rights. We recover from that. Then you look at Rajiv Gandhi. The moment he's hit by criticism, again you have a kind of act that was being foisted upon us, the Post and Telegraph Act, which thank goodness we could stop. Then you come to the UPA years. You have a large number of draconian impositions. You have sedition applied in one day to 6,000 people. You have, Section 66A clamped, people are arrested. Unfortunately, our politics has been defined by a political class that is increasingly becoming insecure. So this is not to do only with the BJP, let me tell you. So any government that comes in looks to control the press. I have experience because I have served as an editor under at least 4 governments now, right? And each one of them will try to control the narrative. And it devolves upon you as a journalist to draw the lines for yourself, the red lines. So on the issue of rights, remember, for example, I'll give you a very small example. I don't know if you're familiar with the term urban naxals. Now, when was this term coined and for what reason? So the term was coined by the UPA and it is part of an affidavit submitted to the Supreme Court. The clampdown that happened on NGOs in India, including some of the leading ones, which today cry the loudest about their freedoms being proscribed, were put on a list, blacklist, by the UPA. Certain laws that today are used in a draconian fashion came up during the UPA. On the other issue of communalism, on speeches, for example, unfortunately, again, if you look at the history of this country from 47 onwards, there are many Congress leaders who have indulged in very vitriolic statements, and they're on record. Now, does that make the Congress party communal? Sorry. Does that make the Congress party communal? There are other political parties, the Samajwadi Party, the RJD, the AIUDF, the MIM, there are left parties. All of them have had brushes with vicious hate speech, where they have channeled it, they have perpetuated it, but yet we call them secular. But when a few BJP leaders, very condemnable, come up and make hate speeches, we say, oh, this is tracing the intellectual trajectories from Hinduism or Hindutva. The Supreme Court itself makes no distinction between Hindutva, Hinduism. I don't even like to use the word Hinduism because isms are not part of our outlook. The word Hindu came from outside. We didn't even have anything. So Sanatana Dharma is something that one can appreciate and you should deploy and employ. Sanatana Dharma is not about seeing people through prisms of otherness. So if you are a believer in it, then by nature you will be accommodative. Now, there have been aberrations and you're right to point them out. And in fact, in my book, I have mentioned that the BJP is trying to clamp down on these elements from within. Sometimes they do it more effectively, other times they don't. Like, for example, as you know, just recently, 2 leaders who were on a blacklist have been now brought back into the political arena again. Raja in Telangana and another gentleman who got up in the House of Parliament, member of the House of Parliament, and said something nasty about another individual. That person is now campaigning in Rajasthan. So it is happening. I'm not saying that it's not happening, but it's also happening on the other side. And that doesn't mean that these aberrations are the norm. These are aberrations and we should appreciate them as that, and we should expect the law of the land to be applied equally. And if it's not being applied equally, we should call it out. And I think the fact that you can ask me this question today under a BJP government that is presumed to be very hawkish and against free speech, the fact that we're having this very open conversation and criticizing also the BJP as well as appreciating some of the things they do, shows that we're an open society by definition and continue to be so. So as I was saying, to use, the aberration and extrapolate from there and suggest that that is the norm would be wrong. I mean, you have had sectarian violence in a large number of Indian states. For example, in Punjab, where Hindus were pulled out of, buses, lined up and shot. Now, all of that happened under a number of governments. And because it happened under those governments and there was at some level tacit support, for example, for the pogrom here in Delhi in 1984, and the Prime Minister of that time sort of even seemed to justify that pogrom, could we say that the Congress party is completely communal and traces its origins to some sort of communal ideology? Look at the theist parties, look at the atheist parties in Tamil Nadu. A large number of them have a problem with Sanatana Dharma. Should we now say that, and they say very poisonous things, their leaders step up to the stage and say horrible things? Are they communal in their orientation? So, there are all of these things. As I was saying, let's not pick on the aberration and then extrapolate from there and seem to suggest that, all Hindus and the entire BJP and the Sangh and everybody is communal at its very core.
Point, Mr. Rahul, point well taken. Let's move forward. Explain to me another thing. For this Bharat, for this new Bharat, do we also need to change the constitution?
This is a question that I can't fundamentally answer. So we have looked at that possibility, and I think that, I begin a chapter. Again, we are coming to Can India be tolerant without being secular, which is chapter 9 of the book.
9.
I start by saying how to be both. I start by saying, and that's the subtitle, in fact, of the chapter. Let's say sometime in the future, a government through an amendment were to remove the word secularism from the preamble to the Indian Constitution and replace it with the word Hindu. What if hypothetically the preamble were to then read, "We the people of India having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign socialist Hindu democratic republic and to secure to all its citizens dash 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 unquote question mark." Could such a putative Indian state have a Hindu identity and still be a plural Mecca for minorities? That's the question I'm posing. As we have demonstrated, a Hindu Rashtra driven by an inherently plural, variegated, non-proselytizing dharma can hardly pose a threat to other more organized religions and denominations. If anything, we've shown that Hindus, even in the face of existential threats, are vulnerable to bouts of fractious infighting enabled by Hinduism's own inherent elasticity. Now, this is a thesis, and we build it. And as I said, we go on to suggest that if anything, even if someone were to revoke the word secularism and insert the word Hindu, we are postulating that if it is dharmic, the foundation of the philosophical foundation of the new republic, then we will be not a Hindu Pakistan, but a Hindu Britain. And the whole book really explains why. But if you're asking me from a constitutional perspective, there is a whole chapter that is dedicated to this, the judiciary's Bharat, and it is chapter 10, Yato Dharmastato Jaha. Now, I think we must accept one thing, which is that whether it was the parliament, whether it's the constitution or the constitutional assembly debates, they focused on this possibility. And many people said the word secular must be inserted into the constitution at its birth, at the birth of the Indian state, the modern Indian state. And the view was taken that we don't need to, because while we should be Panth Nirpeksh, we don't need to be Dharam Nirpeksh, because Dharam is not religion. Dharma is not religion. Dharma, our philosophical core as a people, as a culture, is inclusive. It is holistic. It is a set of ethics. And it is a view on life. It is not even a way of life. It is a view on life. So, if any putative Indian constitution were to lean back on Hindu Dharma for a new Bharat, we would not be a religious exclusivist state that Pakistan is. So Mr. Tharoor there and others who amplify those fears are wrong on that account. And, let me also tell you that if you look at the entire legislative history, we have never had, in the last 10 years of the NDA rule, because we can only go by the last 10 years of NDA rule under a majority BJP government, we have never had one policy of state that has been exclusivist entirely. Someone points to a particular Disturbed Areas Act amendment that was brought in Gujarat, for example, some years ago. But the genesis of that Disturbed Areas Act again goes back to Congress times. We have not had one policy. However, in the years before that, we've had several policies that have been exclusivist. And there's a whole list of them. and I can go through each one of them, some of the more prominent ones that are in discussion right now. Place of Worship Act, for example. It militates predominantly against Hindus. You talk about, the codification of the Hindu personal code. Again, it only impacted Hindus. You look at the HRMC Act, predominantly where temples are brought under state control, predominantly Waqf Act, predominantly in favor of one particular community, and there are no equivalents on the other side. So there are several of these acts, bills, legislation for the creation, for example, of a minority affairs ministry under the UPA. The talk of bringing a religious quota for minorities, Muslim minorities. Again, policy thrust. You've not had that. So, from a purely doctrinal point of view, the BJP has not, even though it has a majority, lent itself to exclusivism from a governance framework. Okay. So even if we were to have a Hindu Rashtra, I don't believe, this is just I suppose, a very subjective prognostication on my part, we won't have the kind of exclusivist state that we see elsewhere. Now, I go through, in fact, in this chapter, you have had many judgments.
Mr. Rahul, hold on a second. I need to ask you another question. Another thorny issue that was going on since last 75 years was Article 370. And in the book, you have mentioned in your book how important was it to abrogate the special status. Explain to the viewers, why was it necessary to abrogate this special status for this concept of Bharat to come into being?
First of all, Article 370 was born out of a sense of what is known as today and described by many people as the politics of appeasement. In fact, on page 18 of this book, the first chapter itself, I have labeled it in a different way. Why have I called it dismantling the architecture of otherness? Because it creates a sectarian divide, Article 370. The BJP views the abrogation of Article 370 and its corollary, 35A, as a legitimate step towards dismantling the architecture of otherness. These are phrases that have been used. We have a footnote also taking us to that particular point. The same can be said for its support of a uniform civil code or the backing of some of its members for the legal campaign to reclaim Hindu temples. The other being those feeling hard done by, victims of Nehruvian state's political policies dictated by the compulsions of securing the interests of India's Muslims. Amit Shah and the BJP, more than 6 decades after Mukherjee's letters to Nehru on Kashmir, fell back on the ideas of their Margdarshak Mukherjee to justify government's decision. Now, I go into a long explanation for why it was important to remove this. And let me read you a few extracts of the book. Now, I don't think I'll be able to do justice to my own writing. So, first of all, let's divest ourselves that there was some monumental change. Article 370 as it existed on 5th August 2019, by the way, had already been modified so many times that it perhaps lost its significance as a provision guaranteeing functional autonomy to Jammu and Kashmir as envisaged by those who advocated it. It had been so watered down, hollowed out.
But why this need to abrogate if it was watered down?
Because there was a lot of, still there were vestiges that created an architecture of otherness that still remained. Very pertinently, 35A was also problematic. Now, Kashmiriyat has evolved from a centuries-old secularism fortified by Upanishadic principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, dating back to when the region was the seat of monasteries and Hindu ascetics. Even Guru Nanak, it is widely believed, sought out the heavenly abode of Kashmir on his journeys to seek enlightenment. When Islam came to Kashmir, it recognized this pastiche of pluralism and give space and even patronage to these other philosophical traditions. Now, as pointed out earlier, some ideologies believe that far from tethering Jammu and Kashmir to the mainland, Article 370 and 35A, in fact, militate against Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. These provisions accelerate xenophobia, spurring the ghettoization of the Kashmir Valley. Only those who see the world through a monochromatic lens or have a vested interest in championing exclusivism could logically back these provisions. There is much merit in this argument. Just give me 3 minutes and I'll sum it up. There is much merit in this argument. The provisions of Article 370 and 35A discriminate between man and woman, as well as insider and outsider. After all, why would anyone create a legal architecture that views with a jaundiced eye the children of Kashmiri women who are married outside the state? Why would such miscegenation be seen as insidious? Why should anyone back a law that denies the offspring of such pan-India unions the right to inherit and by extension disincentivize Kashmiri women from marrying an outsider of their choice? Further, why would anyone deny equal rights to persecuted Hindu refugees fleeing the rapacity of religious persecution in Pakistan? Why would you shackle Valmikis who were brought in 1957, brackets to work as sweepers, brackets shut, to the pernicious and abhorrent tag of untouchability? Given these facts, can Article 370 and 35A really be called the keystones of insaniyat in a modern democracy? It is true that guaranteeing Hindus, Sikhs, and other creeds a domicile status, and therefore a ticket to a dignified existence, will undoubtedly dilute Kashmiri Muslim influence and interest in the valley. But as saffron ideologues point out, that's a small price to pay for dismantling the architecture of otherness and furthering the cause of governance as directed by Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, a defining article of Sanatana Dharma. I think this explains that the laws that exist even now, or did till that date in August 19th, created this distinction between classes and types of people, which I'm sure even you would agree has no rationale. If Kashmiriyat is all inclusive, how can Kashmiriyat tolerate a law that creates these binaries? This is my question to you.
But then the majority of the Kashmiris again feel betrayed because they wanted this Article 370 there.
It was always meant to be a temporary provision in the Indian constitution. You will recall that.
As you have said that it was diluted, my again question, what was the need of abrogating the thing? If all the laws could be implemented in Jammu and Kashmir, what was the need?
Yes, but as I said, that the associative articles, what was diluted? The right, for example, of Kashmiris to fly 2 flags, to call their leader Sadai Riyasat. All of those were removed. But at a societal level, the architecture of otherness remained. And how can you have an integrated society when you have exclusivism? After all, sir, there are Muslims living in other parts of the country also. They will also say, then why should we also have these rights? Article 370 exists in other northeastern states also in some.
But why it's in the other in other eastern states they have not done anything there? Why only with Kashmir?
I think one has to fundamentally understand that over a period of time, decisions are taken looking at circumstances. I think you will agree today that Kashmir is a much more peaceful place. And why will you agree with me on this? Because statistics show that many more tourists are going there. Lesser incidents of terror attacks are taking place. There has been visible on ground assimilation of various cultures. Shias, for example, after 35 long years could take out a procession on Muharram. Kashmiri
but
Hindus
it was the administration who didn't allow them to take out this procession, not the people. This had nothing
Uh,
to do with the people, with the inclusiveness of the
that
Kashmiris.
is now, Danish bhai, that is a bit debatable because people would not accept very easily. For example, Kashmiri Hindus would not accept not being able to go to Sharda Peeth, for example, easily if it was only an administrative issue. So there was a greater fear at work, and one should not ignore the legacy of violence. We know that in various Muslim countries, for example, the most egregious crimes against Muslims are committed by other Muslims. There is no RSS there. There are no Hindus there. So look at Pakistan, for example. Ahmadiyas, Hazaras, atheists, Hindus, Sikhs, Jains are targeted. Christians are killed. And if you look at it, obviously, these people felt that their rights were being proscribed. Then you have to ask the question, where does this feeling of ascendancy come from? Maybe it comes from some legal provisions. You have to look at the pathology. That's what I've looked at in the book.
Again, in the book, you have mentioned about the opposition parties. They fear that 2024 may be the last elections, democratic last elections. Why they are fearing that 24 can be the last elections? And what is this fear about?
Well, Danish bhai, as I said, you know, politics is the art of making the impossible possible. So rhetoricians exist on all sides of the fence. Uh, we have had rhetoricians say to us that, look, through time, decades altogether, that India is not going to survive. If you look at Ram Guha's book, um, India after Gandhi, several times he makes references to foreign publications who have written off India, journalists who have said, this country is not viable. But I think they've been all proven wrong. So talk is cheap. People will say, this man, he's going to destroy the ethos of the country. He is going to take a wrecking ball to secularism. But the facts don't suggest that. As I pointed out to you just a short while back, in fact, I think some of these secular parties should fear their own communalism. In the name of perpetuating secularism, they have actually forwarded a sense of siege upon large number of Hindus. And the backlash has resulted in the BJP coming to power. The BJP is in a sense the creation of the Congress party and its warped ideologies. Its inability to accommodate different strands. At one time, and Rajni Kothari has said this, I haven't, the Congress system collapsed. Mismanagement, plebiscitary form of Indira Gandhi's politics, call it whatever you want. The Congress could not carry people along. It could not carry people of different castes along. So caste-based parties emerged. At one time, from the extreme right to the extreme left, the Congress represented a spectrum of our political thought. The Congress itself cannibalized itself. It is to blame. In fact, if you look at, there is a little piece that I have included in this from Dilip Padgaonkar, some immensely respectable journalist, editor, as also Mr. Jain, Girilal Jain, who was another legendary journalist. And he talks about, and of course there is V.S. Naipaul. So I'm just trying to look through that and pull out that area. And basically, I'm trying to go to that aspect of it where he talks about this decision on part of the Congress or whatever to take the Hindu out of the Indian completely. And this is fundamentally impossible in a country like ours. The bedrock is a Hindu culture.
Mr. Rahul, has BJP been able to reclaim the past in last 10 years?
I think I won't say just the BJP. I think there is a greater appreciation for India's civilizational ethos. And what is happening, for example, the G20 logo, you know, the imprint was Vasudhaiva Kutumbakum. Now, that doesn't come from the BJP's mind, that comes from our Dharma Shastras. In fact, this word or something akin to it is even written in Parliament. So,
in the old Parliament.
Yes, and the new. So it is engraved. In fact, some of these great pronouncements from our Vedic times, our Hindu civilizational dharmic past, even on Supreme Court, if you look at the dome, there are lovely words written there. Invocation to openness, to new ideas. The Parliament, in fact, says we should be open to all ideas. We should be a cradle of.
Mr. Rahul, I want to ask you one fundamental question. There is no denying in the fact that India is a Hindu country. From the ancient times, it has been majorly a Hindu country. There were Hindu kings, Hindu emperors, and all these. And for a brief period of time, there were also Muslim emperors in India. But what happened to Nehru in 1947? What happened to those founding fathers? Why did they pull up this hat of secularism out of nowhere? You have also mentioned about how Nehru was unable to distinguish himself from the past, and he had to go through that Senegal inauguration in the parliament. Yeah, Senegal, yes. which has been mentioned in the book. What happened? What basically was Nehru thinking? Why did he took India to this path?
Well, I think I've already sort of talked about it in this conversation, but we dedicate at least 2 chapters
on this. Exactly.
Yes. So secularism came to mean the state's rights to regulate religion in our country. Can you believe it? Not all religions, but one religion or one way of being. Secularism came to being appeasement politics, which meant that you would excessively orientate towards a minorityism, which is deny that the majority had any stake, civilizational stake in your society. In the name of progressivism and modernism, you began to look back at Hindu culture as being somehow, steeped in superstition and conservatism, ultra-conservatism, and not progressive, and many things like that. And there is a very interesting part where, in fact, this business of championing exclusively one kind of history is actually adopted by a committee that was formed to draft the textbooks of this country. And let me just read out that. I'm going to pull that out. It's very interesting because the secularization of history, was a project that was extremely dogmatically followed by Nehru. So, over 2 decades, the Committee on School textbooks of the Government of India in 1969 continued with the project of secularizing history. While paying lip service to the idea that there can be no compromise with truth, the committee went on to recommend, in view of the fact in teaching Indian history in the past during British rule, stress has often been laid on religious differences and conflict. It is necessary that we should now highlight those situations, and they are legion, where people of all religious faiths have worked together in unity and cooperation, where certain facts of history are important in themselves, cannot and indeed should not be ignored. They should be used widely to show how ugly these episodes of the past are, things of which all of us should be ashamed, and everything should be done to avoid them in the future. This would obviously, now pay attention, this would obviously involve a creative and purposeful reinterpretation of history. and judicious selection of historical truths. The interests of national unity and the needs of a modernizing society should be the primary considerations in our choice and presentation of material, unquote. On the other hand, one of the principal architects of the Indian Constitution was also a serious skeptic when it came to the notion that, for example, Hindu-Muslim relations were underpinned by any deep sense of collective belonging to India. So Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, in his book, Pakistan or the Partition of India, responds to the arguments that champion composite culture, the prevalence of Hindu customs in Muslim practices, and the idea that Muslim peers had Hindu disciples, that Hindu yogis had Muslim chelas, or that saints or prominent religious figures from both communities sometimes shared the closest of bonds. Now, you see, what I'm trying to say is that while it was important for modern India to have a very stable society where there was brotherly love between communities, you could not forget or you could not erase from our past, from our intellectual past, the fact that there were episodes in our history where crimes were committed, and they were usually committed by settler colonialists. Now, you can call them the British, you can call them some of the Islamic people who came from Afghanistan, Turkey, Turkmenistan rather, and other parts of the Middle East as well as Central Asia. You can't just paper over that. And there is a word for, historical memory, and it is called, in German, for example,
Taking you back.
It's a very long word.
Long word, yeah.
Yeah, which means coming to terms with the past.
Can you once again pronounce this German word? Because I couldn't.
Okay, now I'm no expert in German. So it's called Vergangenkein Hauptsaus Freibrightung. If you say it fast, but let me say it slowly. Vergangenheitssau Freibrightung. That's what it is. It's a mouthful. It's got a large number of syllables in it. It's a very long word.
It's around 20 word letter.
Okay, good that you counted. Maybe even more, actually.
Yeah, maybe even more. So we have been discussing all these since last 1 hour now, one and a half hour. So I'm coming to end of this book, this discussion, and I'm coming to my last question. Do minorities, especially the Muslims, need to fear the concept of Bharat?
I think minorities must read this book because it will allay all their fears. I think this book is very important, viewers, and all listeners and book lovers who are listening to Danish today, that we understand and unpack the propaganda around what is usually dismissed as a very communal outlook of the Sangh. Trace the trajectory of the Sangh itself in this book and the change in thought. In fact, today the Sangh is perhaps being led by the most open-minded chief, Mr. Mohan Bhagwat, who is, I think, should be credited with bringing perestroika, to use a Russian word, to the concept of the Sangh's outlook. And I think he is moving the needle far forward. And I think the Sangh is evolving. And if you just listen to what he says that the time to fight battles of the past is over. And I've quoted him. And he also says that, look, we must give up these ideas of supremacism. So he makes an appeal also. So I think if minorities introspect a little bit and they read this book, they will come to the conclusion that perhaps India is in the right place. And we're in the right place at the right time.
Mr. Rahul Shankar, thank you very much for talking to me. I once again hold your book high for the readers so that it reaches maximum people. And I hope people do read this book. Thank you very much for
It's a
talking to me.
pleasure speaking to you, Danish bin Nabi, and thank you very much for going through this book. And it's a fantastic podcast you have because you have been
Thank
able
you.
to ask the most pertinent questions. Thank you very much.
Please subscribe to our channel Roportaj and press the bell icon to remain updated.